The wind had teeth. It gnawed through the thin wool of her coat, a merciless predator in the vast, open plains of Wyoming. Elara clutched the worn fabric tighter, a futile gesture against the cold that had already sunk deep into her bones. The railway platform was nothing more than a few weathered planks of wood laid over gravel, a lonely punctuation mark in a sentence of unending, dun-colored earth and bruised purple sky. Hours ago, the train had hissed away, its plume of smoke a fading ghost against the horizon, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. With it had gone her hope. She had waited. She had stood with her small valise at her feet, scanning the empty track for a wagon, for the face of Mr. Alastair Finch, the man whose letters had promised a new life, a home, a husband. The letters spoke of a sturdy house with a porch swing and a future for the child she carried, a secret she had confessed only in her final correspondence, a plea for understanding that had, it seemed, been met with this brutal silence. The sun, a smear of apricot and rose, had bled out across the western rim of the world, and now the cold was asserting its true authority. Every gust that swept across the prairie felt like a personal judgment, a scornful whisper telling her what she already knew in the hollow pit of her stomach: he was not coming. She was alone. Abandoned. The word was a shard of ice in her heart. She shifted her weight, a dull ache spreading through her lower back, a constant reminder of the life nestled within her, a life utterly dependent on her survival. The stakes were no longer just her own shame or her broken dreams, they were the fragile, fluttering heartbeats she sometimes felt beneath her palm. That tiny, innocent existence was the reason she had traveled 2,000 miles, the reason she had endured the rocking of the train, the stares of strangers, the gnawing anxiety. It was the reason she could not simply sit down on these cold planks and let the encroaching night consume her. Her senses, sharpened by fear, took in the stark reality of her prison. The smell of dust and dry grass, the faint, metallic tang of the rails. The rustle of something unseen in the brittle weeds beside the track. Above, the first stars pricked the deepening indigo of the sky, cold and impossibly distant, indifferent witnesses to her plight. She pressed a hand to the swell of her belly, a protective, desperate gesture. Panic, a cold and slithering thing, tried to coil around her throat, but she fought it back, forcing air into her lungs. She had to think. There was no town in sight, only the vast, swallowing emptiness. To stay here was to freeze. To walk into that darkness, with no knowledge of the land or its dangers, felt like another kind of surrender. Her gaze fell upon the small, unmanned station house, little more than a shed. Its door was surely locked, its single window a dark, vacant eye. But it was structure. It was a sliver of shelter against the wind that howled with increasing fury, a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the desolation in her soul. A shiver racked her body, violent and uncontrollable. It was not just from the cold. It was the tremor of a life unmoored, of a trust so foolishly given and so cruelly betrayed. Mr. Finch's words, once a balm of reassurance, now mocked her from the pages of memory. A warm hearth awaits you, my dear Elara. A place to call home. The hearth was a world away. Home was a phantom. And the night was just beginning. The darkness became absolute, a thick, starless blanket that smothered the landscape and erased the horizon. Elara had managed to force the station house door, the wood groaning in protest as the rusted lock finally gave way. The space inside was no warmer, but it broke the relentless assault of the wind. It was a small, dusty box that smelled of mice and old paper. A single wooden bench ran along one wall, and a cold, pot-bellied stove stood silent in the corner. She sank onto the bench, her body screaming with exhaustion. The valise dropped to the floor with a dull thud, the sound unnervingly loud in the tomb-like quiet. She ran her hands over her arms, trying to generate a friction that was no match for the invasive chill. Her thoughts, a frantic and chaotic swarm, began to settle into a grim, looping pattern. She saw the faces of the women in her boarding house back in Boston, their pitying glances when they learned of her condition, the whispers that followed her down the hall. She had seen the advertisement for a wife in the newspaper as a lifeline, a chance to escape the shame and secure a future for her child. Mr. Alastair Finch's letters had been so proper. He wrote of his modest ranch, of his need for a companion, of his willingness to accept her, child and all. He had seemed kind, honorable. A gentleman. How could she have been so naive? The words on a page were only ink, a vessel for whatever lies a man chose to pour into them. The cold was a constant, seeping pressure. It made her teeth chatter and her muscles ache. She curled into herself on the narrow bench, drawing her knees up as best she could around the curve of her belly. The baby shifted, a slow roll that was both a comfort and a fresh wave of terror. I am sorry, she thought, directing the silent apology inward. I am so sorry I have brought you to this. She thought of her own mother, dead these 5 years, a woman whose warmth had been the only real home Elara had ever known. What would she say if she could see her now? The thought brought a familiar ache, a grief that was a constant companion. But her mother had also been a woman of immense fortitude, a woman who had faced hardship with a squared chin and a steady gaze. The memory was a small, flickering ember in the vast coldness of her despair. She would not honor that memory by giving up. She had to last until morning. Surely, in the light of day, someone would come. A farmer, a traveler. The train was not a daily visitor, she knew, but the track itself was a vein of civilization in this wild country. Someone had to use it. She forced herself to her feet, pacing the small confines of the room, the movement clumsy but necessary. She stamped her feet, the sound echoing off the bare walls. She peered through the grimy window, but there was nothing to see, only an impenetrable blackness that seemed to press against the glass. The hours crawled by, each one a small eternity. The wind shrieked and moaned around the corners of the shack, a chorus of despair. At some point, exhaustion overtook her fear. She huddled back on the bench, pulling her coat as tightly around her as possible, and drifted into a fitful, shivering sleep, haunted by dreams of falling through ice into black, freezing water. She woke with a start, unsure of what had disturbed her. The wind had died down to a low whisper. The room was no longer completely black, but filled with a faint, pearly gray light. Dawn. Hope, fragile and tentative, stirred within her. She pushed herself up, her joints stiff and protesting, and went to the window. The world outside was transformed. A thick, silvery mist clung to the ground, shrouding the prairie in an ethereal silence. The landscape was muted, its harsh edges softened into a dream. And through that mist, a figure was moving. At first, it was just a shape, a dark disruption in the uniform gray. It was slow, steady, deliberate. A horse and rider. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Was it him? Finch? Had he come late, delayed by some unforeseen trouble? A part of her, the part that still clung to the foolish hope that had brought her here, leaped at the possibility. But as the figure drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something different. This rider sat tall and straight in the saddle, not with the slumped posture of an older man she had pictured Finch to be. The horse was a powerful dark beast, its breath pluming in the frigid air. They moved as one entity, a stark silhouette against the brightening eastern sky. He rode directly toward the station, his path unwavering. Fear, a different kind now, pricked at her. This was a stranger. A man alone in a place where there were no witnesses. Her hand went instinctively to her belly. She was vulnerable in a way she had never been before. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she hide? Bar the door? But the flimsy lock was already broken, and there was nowhere to run. The sound of hooves crunching on the gravel outside stopped. Silence. Elara held her breath, her ears straining. Then, the heavy tread of boots on the wooden platform. A shadow fell across the doorway. The man who stood there filled the frame. He was tall, dressed in worn canvas and leather, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his gaze sweeping the small, dim interior, finally settling on her. His eyes, when she dared to meet them, were the color of a winter sky, clear and startlingly pale. They held no warmth, but no immediate malice either. They were the eyes of a man who observed, who assessed. He took in her disheveled state, the valise on the floor, the pronounced swell of her stomach that her coat could not hide. A flicker of something passed through his expression, not pity, but a kind of stark comprehension. "You've been here all night," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, the sound of a man unaccustomed to using it. Elara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She clutched the lapels of her coat, a small, defensive gesture. He looked past her, at the cold stove, then back at her face, pale and smudged with dust in the morning light. He seemed to be weighing a decision, his jaw tight. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft snort of his horse outside. She braced herself for a question, an accusation, or worse, for him to simply turn and leave her there. Instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if to himself. He turned without a word and walked back toward his horse. Elara's fragile hope withered. He was leaving. Of course, he was leaving. Why would a stranger take on her trouble? But then he returned, carrying a thick, rolled-up blanket of dark wool. He held it out to her. His gaze did not meet hers, it was fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "The next town is a day's ride. You won't make it on foot," he stated, his tone flat, factual. "My place is closer. You can get warm there." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned. It was not an act of charity offered with a smile, but a practical solution to a problem he had encountered. There was no promise of more, no kindness in his voice, only a stark assessment of her reality. She looked from the blanket to his unreadable face. Trusting another man felt like an act of profound foolishness after the betrayal of the night. But the alternative was to remain here, to wait for a slow, cold death. The life inside her gave a faint, insistent flutter. She had to choose life. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out and took the blanket. The wool was coarse and heavy, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and horse. It was the smell of survival. The journey was a silent one. He had lifted her onto the horse with an unnerving, impersonal strength, settling her in front of him in the saddle. She sat stiffly, acutely aware of the solid wall of his chest at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The heavy wool blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, a shield against the biting wind that had picked up with the rising sun. She clutched her small valise in her lap, the last remnant of her old life. The man, he had not offered a name, and she had not dared to ask for one, guided the horse with a quiet confidence, his hands sure on the reins. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the weathered rocks and hardy sagebrush that dotted the plains. The mist had burned off, revealing a country that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The sky was a vast, aching blue, and the land stretched on forever, a rolling sea of pale golds and browns under the cold morning light. There were no roads, only faint trails that the man seemed to read as clearly as a map. He navigated the terrain with an economy of motion, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. Elara watched his hands. They were chapped and calloused, the knuckles scarred, but they were competent. They were the hands of a man who worked, who wrestled a living from this unforgiving earth. She found a strange sort of reassurance in them. Her own hands, soft and pale from city life, seemed useless by comparison. She was a creature of paved streets and gas lamps, utterly adrift in this wilderness. Her survival was now entirely in the grasp of this silent, formidable stranger. The thought should have terrified her more than it did. After the crushing despair of the night, there was a strange numbness in its place, a sense of having been stripped down to the barest essentials. All that mattered was warmth, shelter, and the well-being of her child. This man, whatever his motives or his past, was offering all three. An hour passed, then another. The rhythmic sway of the horse, the man's steady presence behind her, and the lingering exhaustion from her vigil began to lull her. Her head grew heavy, and she found herself leaning back slightly, her head resting for a moment against the rough canvas of his coat. She jerked upright immediately, embarrassed, but he gave no sign that he had noticed. He just kept riding, his focus fixed on the distant, hazy line of low mountains. Finally, she saw it. Tucked into a shallow basin, sheltered by a small grove of hardy cottonwoods, was a cabin. It was not the sturdy, painted house of Mr. Finch's letters. It was a small, rugged structure of hewn logs, chinked with mud, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A rough-hewn corral stood nearby, along with a small barn that looked as weathered and resilient as the cabin itself. It was an outpost of human existence in a vast and indifferent wilderness. It looked stark, lonely, and utterly solid. As they drew closer, he finally spoke, his voice startling her out of her reverie. "This is it." He swung down from the horse with a practiced grace before reaching up for her. His hands went to her waist, and he lifted her down as easily as if she were a child. Her legs, stiff from the ride, nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch firm and brief, before he released her and turned to his horse. He began to unsaddle the animal, his movements efficient and unhurried. Elara stood there, clutching her valise and the blanket, feeling small and out of place. This was his home. His sanctuary. And she was an intruder, a piece of flotsam washed up on his shore. The cabin door opened and a dog, a large, shaggy creature the color of dust, emerged. It trotted toward the man, tail giving a low, tentative wag. The man paused in his work to rub the dog's head, murmuring something too low for her to hear. The animal's presence was another small reassurance. A man who was kind to his dog could not be entirely without a soul. He finished with the horse, giving it a final pat before leading it toward the barn. He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "Go inside. Doors open. There's a fire." He disappeared into the barn without waiting for a reply. Left alone with the shaggy dog, which now sat watching her with intelligent, curious eyes, Elara hesitated for a moment. Then, driven by the cold that still clung to her, she walked the few steps to the cabin and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth that greeted her was a physical shock. It wrapped around her, melting the ice in her veins, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The inside was one room, clean and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling cheerfully within it. There was a simple wooden table with two chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves holding a few tins and supplies. It was a place of solitude, built for purpose, not comfort. Yet, at that moment, it felt like the most luxurious sanctuary she had ever seen. The fire beckoned, a vibrant, living thing in the quiet room. She dropped her valise and the blanket and moved toward it, holding out her trembling hands to the heat. The warmth soaked into her skin, into her very bones, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the violent shivers began to subside. He came in a few minutes later, stamping the dust from his boots on the threshold. He carried a bucket of water, which he set down by a dry sink. He moved about the small space with a quiet familiarity, adding a log to the fire, checking a pot of what smelled like coffee that sat warming on the hearth. He did not speak to her, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Elara remained by the fire, unsure of her place, of the etiquette required in this bizarre situation. She was a guest, a refugee, a burden. She felt she should say something, offer thanks, but the words felt inadequate, hollow. Her entire world had collapsed and been rebuilt in the span of 12 hours, and this silent man was the architect of its new, fragile foundation. He finally turned to her, holding a tin mug. "Coffee?" She shook her head. "Water." Then, he ladled some from the bucket into another mug and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, his rough and warm, hers icy cold. The simple human contact was a jolt. She drank the water greedily, the cool liquid soothing her dry throat. He took his own mug of coffee and sat at the table, his back to her, staring into the fire. An unspoken arrangement began to form in those first few hours, a rhythm established without a single word of negotiation. He was the provider of this sanctuary, and she, in turn, tried not to be a complete imposition. She saw the small pile of mending in a basket by the cot, a shirt with a torn sleeve, a pair of socks worn thin at the heel. While he was outside, tending to his horse and whatever other chores his life demanded, she found a needle and thread in a small tin and set to work. Her fingers were clumsy with cold at first, but the familiar task was grounding. It was a small thing, a way to offer something in exchange for the life-saving warmth of his fire. When he returned and saw her stitching the seam of his shirt, he stopped in the doorway. His gaze fell on her work, then lifted to her face. He said nothing, but a muscle worked in his jaw. He simply took off his coat, hung it on a peg by the door, and went about his business. And so the days fell into a pattern. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would lie on the makeshift bed he had created for her out of blankets near the hearth, listening to the soft sounds of him preparing for the day. He would leave, and the cabin would be hers. She would tidy the small space, prepare a simple meal from the provisions he kept, and work on the mending. They ate their meals in silence at the small table. The quiet was no longer unnerving, it had become a shared language. She learned about him through observation. She saw the way he cared for his horse, murmuring to it as he brushed its coat. She saw the careful way he sharpened his axe, the precision in his movements as he chopped firewood. He was a man of immense capability and discipline. There was a deep-seated sadness in him, too. She saw it in the rare moments when he thought she wasn't looking, when his gaze would drift to the fire, his expression lost and shadowed. He had a past, a grief that he carried as silently as he did everything else. One afternoon, she found a small, whittled bird tucked away on a high shelf. It was beautifully carved from a piece of pale wood, its lines smooth and graceful. It was a thing of delicate artistry, so at odds with the rugged, practical nature of everything else in the cabin. She wondered about the hands that had made it, and for whom. She put it back carefully, feeling as though she had stumbled upon a private secret. The baby grew more active, its movements stronger, more insistent. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would press her hands to her belly and speak to it in a low whisper, telling it about the warmth of the fire, the sound of the wind, the steady presence of the silent man who had saved them. The cabin was becoming a cocoon, a safe place for them to heal and wait. Trust was not a decision she made, but something that grew slowly, organically, in the shared silence and the daily rhythms of survival. It grew in the steady supply of firewood he kept piled by the door, in the pot of stew he left simmering for her on the hearth when he had to be out longer than usual, in the way he never asked her a single question about her past, about the man who had left her at the station. He accepted her presence as a fact, like the sunrise or the winter cold, and in his acceptance, she found a strange and unexpected peace. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue for days, turned a bruised, sullen gray. A deep and ominous stillness fell over the land, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Silas, she had learned his name from a faded inscription on a leather-bound book on his shelf, Silas Blackwood, seemed to feel the change in the air long before she did. He spent the entire day reinforcing the small barn, checking the seals around the cabin's single window, and chopping a formidable pile of firewood, stacking it neatly against the exterior wall. His movements were imbued with a new urgency. "Storm's coming," he said that evening, his first unsolicited words in days. A bad one, the statement hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He brought in extra buckets of water from the well and secured a heavy bar across the inside of the door. The world outside was shrinking, and their small, one-room cabin was about to become their entire universe. The snow began that night, soft and silent at first, ghostly flakes drifting past the windowpane. By morning, it was a blizzard. The wind rose to a furious howl, driving the snow horizontally, erasing the world in a churning vortex of white. The cabin, which had felt so solid, now seemed a fragile vessel in a raging sea. The wind clawed at the logs and shrieked down the chimney, and the little structure groaned under the assault. They were trapped. The forced proximity shifted the atmosphere between them. The comfortable silence of their routine was replaced by a palpable tension. The room was too small for two people who were not family, not friends, not anything she could name. Every movement was magnified, every breath seemed to echo. Elara felt a wave of dizziness in the afternoon. The room tilted, and she reached out a hand to steady herself against the table. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, was on his feet in an instant. "What is it?" His voice was sharp with concern. "Nothing. I'm just a little lightheaded, but it was more than that." A feverish heat was blooming behind her eyes, and a chill, unrelated to the storm outside, was tracing its way down her spine. By evening, she was shivering violently beneath a mountain of blankets, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The fever had taken hold. Her awareness of the next day or two was fragmented, a fever dream of swirling snow outside the window and the dark, worried shape of Silas moving through the dim light of the cabin. She was aware of him bathing her forehead with a cool, damp cloth, his touch surprisingly gentle. He coaxed her to drink broth, holding the cup to her lips, his expression grim. In a moment of lucidity, she heard him murmuring, not to her, but to himself. "Just hold on. Just a little longer." His voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He tended to her with a relentless, quiet devotion. He kept the fire roaring, the cabin a pocket of feverish warmth against the frozen world. He never slept, she was sure of it. Every time she opened her eyes, he was there, sitting in the chair by her makeshift bed, his gaze fixed on her, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep, profound worry. The storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm raged within her. One night, the fever peaked. She tossed and turned, lost in delirious visions of the train station, of Mr. Finch's smiling face turning into a cruel sneer, of falling into an endless, icy void. She cried out, a thin, desperate sound. A hand closed around hers, strong and steady, anchoring her to the real world. "You're all right," Silas's voice cut through the fog. "I'm here. You're safe." He did not let go. He held her hand through the worst of it, his solid presence a bulwark against the fever's assault. When the fever finally broke, it was like waking from a long, terrible dream. She awoke to silence. The wind had died. Sunlight, brilliant and white off the fresh snow, was streaming through the window. Silas was asleep in his chair, his head slumped forward, his face pale with fatigue. His hand was still loosely holding hers. She lay there, weak but clear-headed, and looked at him. In his sleep, the harsh lines of his face were softened. He looked younger, more vulnerable. This man, this stranger, had fought for her life. He had fought for the life of her child. He had done it without question, without expectation of reward. In the crucible of the blizzard, something profound had been forged between them. The tentative trust she had felt before had been tempered into something stronger, more resilient. It was a bond born not of words, but of shared vulnerability and quiet, steadfast care. When he finally stirred and opened his eyes, he found her watching him. His expression was guarded at first, then relief washed over his features, so visible it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "You're back," he said, his voice hoarse. She could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling impossibly small. He simply nodded, withdrawing his hand as if suddenly conscious of the contact. He stood up, stretched his stiff limbs, and went to the fire to stir the embers back to life. The crisis was over. But the world, and their place in it, had irrevocably changed. The snow lay in a thick, pristine blanket over the land, muffling all sound. The world was clean and bright and new. But their supplies were running low. The blizzard had consumed their reserves, and a trip to the nearest town, a small settlement called Redemption, was unavoidable. Elara, though still weak, insisted on going with him. The thought of being left alone, even in the safety of the cabin, was unbearable. Besides, she felt a fierce, protective need to stand on her own 2 feet, to face the world again. Silas argued, but not for long. He saw the new steel in her eyes and relented, bundling her into the sleigh he had fashioned from a small wagon and wooden runners. The journey to redemption took half a day, the horse pulling the sleigh through the deep, glittering snow. The town was little more than a single muddy street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. As they pulled up to the store, heads turned. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Elara felt their eyes on her like a physical touch, their gazes lingering on her swollen belly, then flicking to the grim, unapproachable man beside her. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke as they stepped onto the boardwalk. "That's Blackwood, what's he doing with her? Look at her, she's in the family way," the words were sharp little barbs. Elara pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, her chin instinctively dipping. This was the judgment she had fled Boston to escape, and here it was, raw and undisguised, in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness. She had forgotten how cruel the world could be outside the sanctuary of the cabin. Silas seemed oblivious, or perhaps immune, to the stares. He moved with his usual economy of purpose, his face an unreadable mask. But Elara saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders squared as he placed a protective hand on the small of her back to guide her through the doorway of the general store. The store's interior was warm and smelled of coffee, leather, and dried apples. The proprietor, a stout man with a suspicious squint named Henderson, stopped polishing the counter as they entered. His eyes flicked from Silas to Elara and back again. "Blackwood," he said, his tone lacking any warmth. "Need supplies." Silas's voice was flat, cutting through the thick atmosphere. He handed Henderson a list. As the proprietor began to gather their things, flour, salt, coffee, tins of peaches, a woman entered the store. She was dressed in a fine wool coat, her face pinched and severe. She was, Elara would learn, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable. Her eyes widened as she saw them, and a look of profound disapproval settled on her face. She ignored Silas completely, her gaze fixing on Elara with a cold, piercing judgment. "Well," Mrs. Gable said, her voice carrying through the quiet store. "It seems the rumors are true. Silas Blackwood has finally brought his shame out into the open." Elara flinched as if struck. The color drained from her face. Shame. The word landed with the force of a physical blow. Before she could react, Silas stepped slightly in front of her, partially shielding her from the woman's venomous glare. He turned his head slowly and fixed his pale, winter sky eyes on Mrs. Gable. He said nothing. He did not need to. The sheer, glacial force of his stare was enough. It was a look that promised consequences, a look that spoke of a man pushed to a limit that was dangerous to cross. Mrs. Gable, for all her bluster, took an involuntary step back, a flicker of fear in her eyes. The store proprietor, Henderson, cleared his throat nervously and began packing their supplies with renewed haste. The confrontation was over in seconds, a silent battle of wills that Silas had won without uttering a single word. He paid for their goods, his movements deliberate, and then guided Elara back out into the cold street. As they loaded the sleigh, she finally understood. His isolation was not entirely by choice. He was an outcast. This town, with its narrow minds and sharp tongues, had judged him long before she ever arrived. His stoicism was a shield, his silence a fortress against their cruelty. Riding back to the cabin, the silence in the sleigh was different. It was filled with her swirling thoughts. She had arrived as a victim, a woman shamed and abandoned. But seeing the town's judgment fall upon Silas, a man who had shown her nothing but quiet decency and life-saving kindness, ignited a spark of anger in her. It burned away the last vestiges of her self-pity. Her fight was no longer just for herself and her child. It was for him, too. For the quiet dignity he maintained in the face of their scorn. She glanced at his profile as he drove, his face set against the wind. He was a good man. A better man than any she had ever known. And she would not be the cause of his shame. When they arrived back at the cabin, the sanctuary felt more sacred than ever. As he unhitched the horse, she stood by the door, waiting. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable as always. "I am sorry," she said, her voice clear and steady. "For what they said. For the trouble I've brought you." He stopped in front of her, his gaze searching her face. "It's not your trouble," he said, his voice low. "It's theirs," and in that simple statement, he absolved her. He took her side against the world, and in doing so, he cemented the bond between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were allies. A week later, just as a fragile spring seemed to be breathing life back into the frozen land, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not Silas, who was out checking his trap lines. This was a stranger, leading a packhorse, heading directly for the cabin. Elara watched from the window, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. There was something in the man's posture, a slump of arrogance even at a distance, that felt unnervingly familiar. As he drew closer, the vague familiarity sharpened into horrifying recognition. It was him. It was Mr. Alastair Finch. But he was not the man from his letters, nor the kind, middle-aged gentleman from the photograph he had sent. This man was younger, harder. His face was fleshy and pale, his eyes small and greedy. The photograph had been a lie. Everything had been a lie. Panic seized her. She looked around the cabin, her sanctuary, now a potential trap. Where was Silas? How far had he gone? She was alone. Finch dismounted, tying his horse to the corral fence with a careless knot. He strode to the door and pushed it open without knocking, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Well, well. Look what we have here. I was wondering where you'd gotten to. Thought a coyote might have carried you off." His voice was oily, condescending. He looked around the small cabin with disdain, his eyes lingering on the neat stack of mended clothes, the clean-swept floor. "Found yourself a little nest, have you?" With some backwoods savage, from the looks of it, Elara stood her ground, her hand resting protectively on her belly. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was the bedrock of anger she had discovered in redemption. The timid woman who had waited at the train station was gone. "What do you want, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice tight but level. His smirk widened. "What I paid for, my dear. A wife. And, as it turns out, a very convenient heir." He took a step closer, and she could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "You see, my late uncle was a sentimental old fool. Left his entire fortune to his firstborn grandchild. A grandchild, I might add, that my barren wife was unable to provide. When your letter arrived, confessing your condition, well, it was a gift from Providence." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The kindness in his letters, the acceptance of her child, it was all a monstrous deception. He didn't want a wife, he wanted an incubator for an inheritance. "The child is mine," she said, the words ringing with a ferocity that surprised even her. "He will have no part of you." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I think you'll find he will. You are my intended bride. That paper you signed, the one that paid for your ticket. It's a contract. Legally, you belong to me. And so does what you're carrying." He moved toward her, his intention clear. He was going to take her, by force if necessary. She backed away, her eyes darting toward the fireplace, toward the heavy iron poker that rested on the hearth. She would not be taken. She would fight. "You'll come with me now," he said, lunging for her arm. "We'll get you settled somewhere proper until the babe is born. Then, you'll be on your way." At that moment, the cabin door swung open. Silas stood on the threshold, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He had returned. His pale eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, Finch's hand on Elara's arm, the fear and defiance in her face, the violation of his home. His expression did not change, but the atmosphere in the room crackled and went cold. Finch dropped Alara's arm as if it were a hot coal, spinning to face the newcomer. "And who the hell are you?" he blustered, trying to regain his composure. "This is a private matter, you're on my land," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you've got your hand on what's mine." The words, possessive and absolute, hung in the air. He wasn't just talking about the land. Finch puffed out his chest. "This woman is my mail-order bride. I have a contract. I've come to collect what I'm owed." "You're owed nothing," Silas stated. He took a slow step into the room, the door swinging shut behind him. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't need to. His presence was threat enough. "She waited all night for you in the cold. You left her. Whatever contract you had was broken then." "That's a matter for the law to decide," Finch sneered, though a bead of sweat was now tracing a path down his temple. "I'll have the sheriff out here." "You do that," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. "But first, you're going to leave." Now, the confrontation was stripped to its essence. It was not about contracts or laws written in some distant town. It was about two men in a small room, with a woman and her unborn child as the prize. It was primal. Finch was a creature of bluster and legal threats. Silas was a man of the earth, a man who understood survival and the brutal finality of this landscape. The odds were not in Finch's favor, and he knew it. Finch hesitated, his gaze flickering between the unmoving figure of Silas and the rifle he held so casually. The bravado began to crumble from his face, replaced by a sullen, resentful fear. He was a predator who had misjudged his quarry, finding not a lone, helpless doe, but a den protected by a wolf. But it was Alara who broke the standoff. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Silas, her shoulder brushing his arm. The woman who had once been paralyzed by fear now felt a strange, blazing calm. She was no longer a piece of property to be claimed or discarded. This cabin was her home. This man was her protector. This life was hers to defend. She looked directly at Alistair Finch, her eyes holding his. "He is right," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the tense silence of the room. "You left me. You broke any promise you ever made. This child," she said, placing both hands over her belly in a gesture of absolute ownership, "will never know your name. You will not touch him. You will not use him. He is not a key to a fortune. He is my son." Every word was a stone laid in the foundation of her new self. She was not just speaking to Finch, she was declaring her own independence, her own strength, to the world, to Silas, and most importantly, to herself. The transformation was complete. The desperate, abandoned woman from the train station was a ghost, a memory. In her place stood a mother, fierce and unyielding. Finch stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had expected tears, pleading, submission. He was not prepared for this resolute woman who stood beside the grim frontiersman, a united front of quiet, unbreakable strength. They were a fortress he could not breach. You'll regret this," he stammered, his threats now sounding hollow and pathetic. "I'll be back with the sheriff. You'll see." Silas took another step forward. He still hadn't raised the rifle, but his intent was unmistakable. "Your horse is outside," he said, his voice flat and final. "Get on it. Ride east. Don't look back. If I ever see your face on this land again, the sheriff will be the last thing you have to worry about." The implied violence was more terrifying than any overt threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Finch, finally understanding the mortal danger he was in, stumbled backward. He fumbled with the door latch, threw one last look of pure hatred at them, and then scrambled outside. They heard the frantic sounds of him untying his horse, the desperate creak of leather as he hauled himself into the saddle, and then the rapid, fading thunder of hooves as he fled. He was gone. The silence he left behind was profound. Alara let out a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak-kneed. She felt Silas's hand on her arm, steadying her. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, not of fear, but of gratitude and a powerful, overwhelming relief. "He won't be back," Silas said. It was a promise. She nodded, unable to speak. He had not just saved her from Finch, he had stood by her, allowing her the space to save herself. He had seen the strength in her and had trusted her to use it. His belief in her was a gift more precious than any physical rescue. He guided her to one of the chairs at the table and gently pushed her into it. He took the rifle and set it carefully in its rack above the mantelpiece. The danger had passed. He then went about the simple, comforting business of rebuilding the fire, his familiar movements restoring a sense of normalcy to the violated space. Elara sat and watched him, her heart full of a complex and powerful emotion she could not yet name. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, resonant connection, a sense of belonging that she had never known. The letters from Mr. Finch had promised her a house. This rugged cabin, with this quiet, solitary man, was the first place that had ever truly felt like home. As evening fell, it began to rain, a soft, cleansing spring shower that washed the dust from the air and pattered gently on the roof of the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. The confrontation with Finch felt like a distant nightmare, its sharp edges softened by the peace that had settled in its wake. Elara and Silas sat at the small table, a pot of stew simmering between them. The silence was back, but it was deeper now, richer. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had faced a threat together and emerged stronger, their unspoken bond now forged into something unbreakable. Elara looked across the table at him. The firelight carved shadows and highlights onto his rugged face, revealing the exhaustion he had hidden so well. But there was a new softness in his eyes as he looked at her, a warmth that had not been there before. "Why did you say it?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He looked up from his stew, a question in his eyes. "What's mine?" she clarified, her voice barely a whisper. "You told him I was yours." Silas set down his spoon. He stared into the fire for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. The man of few words was searching for the right ones. "When I found you at the station," he began, his voice low and steady, "you looked like a bird with a broken wing. Lost. I thought I was just giving you a place to mend before you moved on." He looked back at her, his gaze direct and honest. "But you're not that person anymore. You're not broken. I saw you today. You stood up to him. You fought for your son. You belong here. In this land. It's made you strong." He paused, and the next word seemed to cost him something. "And this place, it's been empty for a long time. It's better with you in it." "So, yes," he said, his voice dropping, raw with emotion. "Mine." To protect, the simple, profound declaration settled in her heart, a warmth that spread through her entire being. He was not claiming her as property, as Finch had sought to do. He was claiming her as part of his life, part of his home, a person to be cherished and defended. This was the true meaning of belonging. She reached a hand across the table, her palm upturned. After a moment's hesitation, he covered her hand with his. His touch was warm and calloused, a comforting weight. A home is not a structure of wood and nails, she thought. It is a place where you are safe, where you are seen, where you are valued. It is a place you build with another person, a shelter against the storms of the world. They had built such a place here, in this small cabin, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The resilience she had been forced to find had become her greatest strength. The vulnerability she had arrived with had blossomed into a fierce, maternal power. She was no longer defined by the man who had abandoned her, or by the society that had scorned her. She was defined by her own courage, and by the quiet, steady man who sat across from her, his hand covering hers. The baby kicked, a strong, insistent thump against her ribs. Silas's eyes flickered down to her belly, a small, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. Without a word, he moved his hand from hers and gently, tentatively, placed it on the swell of her stomach, right where the baby had moved. His touch was full of wonder and a quiet promise. The future was no longer a terrifying void. It was here, in this room, between the three of them. It would not be an easy life, she knew. The land was hard, and the world outside could be cruel. But they would face it together. As the rain whispered on the roof, Elara looked at the man who had ridden out of the dawn to save her, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was finally home.